"You will die cursed." These dramatic words may be the most ancient inscription of the Israelites ever found, dating back to the Bronze Age, 3,200 years ago.
They called it the Mountain of the Curse, just another Bible legend, or so the skeptics scoffed. But when a high-tech scan exposed the name of God itself, sealed inside a scrap of ancient lead that had been discarded decades earlier, history blinked. Suddenly, the story behind the world's oldest Hebrew curse threatens to rewrite everything we know about Scripture, literacy, and belief. How did this impossible tablet survive on Mount Ebal for over 3,000 years, and why had scholars missed it for so long? North of the ancient city of Nablus, a stark ridge rises from the rocky highlands, and the land calls it Mount Ebal. For generations, this summit stood as a silent witness above the valleys, its limestone slopes swept by dry winds and scattered with thorn and scrub. But in the oldest Hebrew texts, Ebal is more than just a landscape. It is the chosen ground for a moment of reckoning. Deuteronomy names Ebal as the place where half the tribes of Israel were commanded to stand and pronounce curses, while their kin across the valley on Mount Gerizim called out blessings. The text draws a map. Cross the Jordan, build an altar of uncut stones on Ebal, write the law in plaster, and gather the nation for a public declaration. Every detail, from the direction of the slopes to the ritual of inscribing the law, is set down with the precision of a legal contract. For centuries, scholars doubted these verses described any real event or place. The highlands, they said, offered no proof, no monumental ruins, no written record. Yet the land itself held its secrets. Ebal's summit, marked by its isolation and its view of the ancient crossroads, matched the scriptural portrait with uncanny accuracy. Here the stones and the soil seemed to wait for someone to test whether the words were memory or myth. The mountain's silence was not emptiness. It was the promise of evidence waiting to be uncovered. Adam Zertal stood on the windswept crest of Mount Ebal in 1982, a field notebook in one hand and a trowel in the other. Raised in a secular kibbutz and shaped by the scars of war, Zertal had come to archaeology not as a believer, but as a skeptic searching for truth in stone. His team began a careful survey of the highlands, mapping every terrace and ruin. On Ebal's summit, they uncovered a massive stone installation, unlike anything else in the region. A rectangular structure built atop an older circular foundation, layered with ash and animal bones. Zertal spent 7 seasons, from 1982 to 1989, excavating this site. He cataloged thousands of stones, fragments of pottery, and the charred remains of young male goats and cattle, evidence, he argued, of ancient sacrifices. The dig produced not just artifacts, but mountains of earth. Each bucket of soil carried away from the altar left behind a growing mound of discarded debris on the eastern slope. These dump piles remained untouched and unsifted for decades, and they held the overlooked byproducts of Zertal's methodical work. Zertal believed the structure matched the biblical description of Joshua's altar, but many colleagues dismissed his claims. The altar theory sparked debate, but the real legacy of Zertal's excavation was material. Tons of untouched spoil left exposed to wind and rain, waiting for another set of eyes and a new generation of questions. In the end, Zertal's greatest contribution may have been the evidence he left behind, sealed in the dirt just beyond the edge of his trenches. Scott Stripling stood at the edge of a forgotten mound, his boots sinking into decades-old debris. The piles of soil, left behind by Adam Zertal's original team, had been written off as archaeological leftovers, too ordinary to warrant a second glance. But to Stripling and the Associates for Biblical Research, these heaps represented something else, an opportunity. Their approach was simple but radical. Instead of breaking new ground, they returned to the discarded earth, convinced that the smallest objects, missed by earlier methods, could hold the answers that eluded Zertal's generation. Stripling's team had seen the power of wet sifting at other sites, where washing soil through fine mesh revealed beads, bones, and bits of metal invisible to the naked eye. The Mount Ebal dump piles, untouched since the 1980s, offered a rare chance to apply this technology to one of the Bible's most contested sites. The goal was not just to recover artifacts, but to recover the overlooked story buried in the dirt. The Associates for Biblical Research's commitment was clear. No fragment was too small, and no detail too trivial if it could shed light on the ancient ceremony described in Deuteronomy. Permits, politics, and security concerns made every visit a logistical puzzle. Yet, with each bucket of soil, Stripling's team pressed on, determined to let science do what skepticism could not. They tested piece by piece whether the mountain's silence still held a message. The decision to re-examine Zertal's spoil was more than a routine project. It was a new mission, fueled by the belief that history sometimes hides in the cast-offs of earlier digs, waiting for a fresh set of eyes and a willingness to look closer. Water splashed over the mesh trays as volunteers worked their way through the stubborn soil, each handful a mixture of dust, stone, and the forgotten remains of an ancient world. The wet sifting station buzzed with quiet focus. Most days, the process yielded little more than bone chips, pottery shards, and the occasional bead. But on a chilly morning in December 2019, a volunteer paused, fingers closing around something dense and cold, a tiny, gray square no bigger than a postage stamp. At first glance, it looked unremarkable, a lump of metal caked with silt. Some thought it might be a fishing weight, though Mount Ebal sits far from any river or lake. The object was oddly deliberate in shape, its edges pressed flat, its corners tucked in. Mud washed away to reveal the unmistakable lines of a folded lead tablet, heavy for its size, with a surface pitted by centuries in the ground. The team gathered around, curiosity sharpening into something closer to awe. Folded lead tablets, known as defictions, were used in the ancient world to seal curses or secret messages, their contents hidden from all but the intended powers. But finding one here in the highlands of the West Bank, among the debris of a contested altar, was something else entirely. The tablet's discovery was a direct result of wet sifting, a method that forced the past to give up what dry sieves had missed. No one dared try to pry it open. The metal was far too brittle. Any attempt would have shattered it into dust. Instead, the artifact was set aside, carefully labeled and protected, its secret message still locked inside. The moment of recovery marked a turning point. What began as a routine search through someone else's cast-offs had produced an object that demanded a new kind of scrutiny. The next step would require technology capable of seeing through solid lead to read what had been hidden for over 3,000 years. Inside a quiet laboratory in Telk, Czech Republic, a team of imaging specialists prepared for a challenge that would test the limits of modern technology. The artifact from Mount Ebal, a lead tablet, barely 2 centimeters across and folded tight as a locket, was too fragile to touch. Any attempt to force it open would have turned 3,000 years of history into dust. The only way in was through the power of X-rays. Using a micro-CT scanner, the Czech scientists began a process more akin to medical imaging than traditional archaeology. The tablet was mounted with care, then bombarded with X-rays from multiple angles. Each pass generated a thin digital slice, one after another, until thousands of slices stacked into a cloud of data. The result was a digital, 3-dimensional map of the tablet's interior, capturing every ridge, crease, and potential scratch hidden beneath the metal's corroded skin. The work demanded patience and precision. Lead, dense and unforgiving, scattered the X-rays and introduced noise into the images. To overcome this, the team adjusted scanning parameters, cycling through different energy levels and orientations to coax out the clearest possible views. Each scan produced a grayscale cross-section, revealing subtle differences in density that hinted at marks or incisions pressed into the metal centuries ago. Once the raw data was in hand, the real detective work began. Specialized software stitched the slices together, reconstructing the tablet's interior as a virtual object. By digitally peeling away layers, the researchers could expose the hidden surfaces, unfolding the tablet in cyberspace without ever disturbing its brittle shell. Tiny details emerged, lines that might be letters, curves that could be deliberate or accidental. The process was iterative, with each new rendering prompting fresh questions and closer scrutiny. Every step moved the team closer to the moment of truth. What had been locked away by time and corrosion was now rendered in pixels, suspended between the ancient world and the digital present. The tablet's secret, once sealed in darkness, stood on the edge of being revealed. When the scans finally revealed the tablet's hidden surface, the first person to study the images was Gershom Galil, an epigrapher with decades of experience reading ancient alphabets. Galil's eyes moved over the grainy, grayscale renderings, searching for patterns among the lines and shadows. What he found was not a jumble of scratches, but a deliberate arrangement, 22 letters each, pressed into the lead with a steady hand, forming a curse that echoed through the centuries. The words did not wander or ramble. They circled back on themselves, repeating a single relentless theme: cursed, cursed, cursed. The text followed a chiastic structure, a poetic device common in the oldest Hebrew writings. The curse unfolded in mirrored phrases, first the word cursed, then the invocation of the god YHHW, then the threat of death, and then the pattern reversed. The lines read, cursed, 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 cursed by the god YHW. You will die cursed, cursed, you will surely die. Cursed by YHW, cursed, cursed, cursed. The repetition was not accidental. It was the language of legal contracts and ritual pronouncements, designed to bind and to warn. The presence of the three letters Yod, He, Wah was the most electrifying detail. This triliteral sequence, YHW, is recognized as the earliest form of the divine name Yahweh. If authentic, it predates every other known inscription of the name by centuries. The curse was not generic. It invoked a specific deity in the very place the ancient texts described. The tablet's message was unmistakable. The power to curse and the power to name God were both present on Mount Ebal long before later scribes ever put pen to parchment. A single artifact, smaller than a coin, began to challenge a century of scholarly consensus. To understand its true age, specialists turned to two lines of evidence: the shape of the letters stamped into the lead and the very atoms of the metal itself. Paleographers trained to read the evolution of script compared the tablet's angular characters to a handful of inscriptions from the late Bronze Age. The forms matched the earliest alphabetic writing known in the Levant, letters that predate classical Hebrew and even the Phoenician script. According to their analysis, the tablet belonged to the period between 1400 BC and 1200 BC, centuries before most historians placed the rise of Israelite literacy. Yet, the story did not stop with script. The lead's origin offered another clue. Samples were sent to a laboratory in Jerusalem where isotope analyst Naama Yahalom Mak traced the metal's unique chemical fingerprint. The results pointed not to a local source, but to the mines of Lavrion in Greece, a region that supplied the eastern Mediterranean with lead throughout the Bronze Age. This connection revealed more than a date. It mapped a network of trade that reached from the Aegean to the highlands of Canaan, passing through the hands of merchants, scribes, and priests. The implications ran deep. If the tablet truly dates to the late Bronze Age, then the people who stood on Mount Ebal were not illiterate shepherds. They were participants in a world that wrote, traded, and remembered. The discovery pressed against the boundaries of established timelines, forcing even the most cautious scholars to reconsider what the highlands might have been, a crossroads of culture, not a backwater of history. Within days of the tablet's unveiling, a new debate took shape. It was not over the artifact's existence, but over what the scans actually revealed. Critics pored over the published images, noting the grainy, low contrast slices and the dense fog of digital noise that blanketed each surface. To some, the marks looked less like letters and more like the accidental scars of time, creases from folding, pits from corrosion, and random scratches pressed deep into the lead. Scholars trained in ancient scripts warned of pareidolia, the mind's tendency to find patterns and symbols where none were intended. Without access to the raw scan data, outside experts could only work from a handful of processed images, each one filtered and enhanced by the original team. Epigraphers, such as Christopher Rolston and Aaron May Ear, challenged the readings, arguing that many supposed letters were incomplete, overlapping, or simply wishful thinking. The lack of transparency fueled suspicion. Requests for the full dataset went unanswered. In academic circles, the call for open data grew louder. If the curse was real, let the evidence be tested by all. For every claim of a structured inscription, there was a counterclaim, random marks, and not writing. The tablet, once a potential breakthrough, became a battleground over the very standards of proof in archaeology. Calls for transparency grew louder as the debate intensified. Leading voices in the field pressed for the release of the tablet's raw scan data. arguing that only full access would allow independent experts to verify or challenge the original reading. Data sharing advocates insisted that archaeology thrives on open scrutiny, not private interpretation. They pointed to established best practices. When a discovery claims to rewrite history, every step of the process must be open to replication. Multiple research groups expressed interest in reanalyzing the tomographic scans, offering to apply alternative imaging algorithms and fresh epigraphic eyes. The proposal was straightforward. Publish the full dataset, including all X-ray slices and processing parameters, so that specialists from competing schools could attempt their own virtual unfoldings. The aim was not to relitigate the inscription in press releases, but to invite a rigorous multi-lab audit, letting the evidence speak through a chorus of independent readings. This push for transparency was about more than settling a single debate. It was a call to raise the standard for archaeological proof, especially when claims touch the foundations of faith and history. By opening the data, the field could move from controversy toward consensus, or at least toward clarity, anchoring the next steps in evidence available to all. Today, a scrap of ancient lead forces scholars to revisit what they thought they knew. As technology sharpens our vision, arguments over myth and history grow less abstract and more urgent. The earliest written name of Yahweh now sits under a microscope, challenging centuries of academic certainty. In the end, truth leaves its mark, sometimes in metal, sometimes in minds. What mark does it leave on you? Share your thoughts below.